in Exodus, the book of Exodus, in chapter 8 tonight. And we're going to continue our study of the plagues, and we're going to cover chapter 8 and chapter 9. And so that's going to take us through the 7th plague of hail. And we're looking at Exodus from the perspective of Pharaoh's response to God's word. And especially in these 2 chapters, I think we get the sense of, you picture in your mind a snowball that just kind of rolls. And you know how snowballs, they pick up more and more and more snow as they roll until they sort of become an avalanche of snow that's rushing down. And I was looking for a picture to put on Facebook today of avalanches to go with the live post, and I found this the moving pictures, the GIFs of an avalanche coming at you, and it was coming right at the screen, and it covered the screen. And even though I knew it was just on my computer, I still sort of, as it like hit the screen, because they're kind of convincing. But you imagine avalanche, if it were coming right at you, it would be kind of a heart-stopping moment. And as we talk about a hardness of heart, if we find ourselves in a position where we see that our heart is rolling quickly to a harder and harder heart, that should be a heart-stopping moment. That should be a terrifying moment of, I need to stop everything and figure this out. And that's where Pharaoh is in Exodus chapter 8. Last time we looked at chapter 7 with the first plague, and the first plague was the river of blood, and the Nile River and every ounce of water that seemed to have ever been associated with it, if it was in a bowl, if it was in a cup, if wherever it was, it all just turned to blood. And while Pharaoh's, his magicians, it says the ones who could do the secret arts, sort of the things that were of sleight of hand, while they could duplicate that in some minor fashion, they couldn't get rid of it. And so the people got shovels, and they got around the edge of the Nile River, and they dug down till they found some fresh water. And that's how they survived a week with this plague. But in chapter 8, he moves into the second plague, and this is the plague of frogs. And so it says that there are just frogs everywhere. They are in the river and out of the river. They're in your homes. When you try to eat your morning bowl of Wheaties, they're going to hop into your milk. When you're trying to, fix your hair up for the day, they're hopping into your hair. And they're just so pervasive that there's really nowhere you can go and nothing you can do that you don't have frogs. I'm sorry. In your bed, yes, when you're trying to sleep. If you've ever, have you ever tried to sleep with a cat in the room, and they like get up on you, and they're kind of, it's like that, but tons and tons of frogs instead, and so they're just everywhere, and you can't live life at all without these frogs bothering you, and of course, there's speculation that perhaps it was more than just the idea of frogs, but what is it that can give you warts and things like that you would have things that, problems that follow even once the frogs are gone, that you just can't escape from. And so Moses tells Pharaoh, this is what's going to come. And then verse 5 tells us Aaron, and again, I hadn't noticed that before. It's not Moses who is stretching out his hand. It's Aaron often, at least in these beginning plagues, that's stretching out his hand on Moses' behalf, and the frogs overwhelm the land. Now, as we go through these, we're going to notice each one gives us something different that is kind of the first time something happened. So this second plague, this is the first time that Pharaoh summons Moses, and he kind of relents. He asks Moses to stop the plague. He tells him, he says specifically in verse 8, entreat the Lord that he may take the frogs from me and from my people. And I will let your people go, that they may sacrifice to the Lord. And then Moses kind of gives them some further evidence. Let's just really drive this home. Verse 9, Moses said to Pharaoh, accept this honor. Right? He's saying, God doesn't have to do this. This is an honor. Accept this honor of saying, when I shall intercede for you, for your servants and for your people, to destroy the frogs from you and your houses, that they may remain in the river only. And so Pharaoh says, okay, it's kind of like when God tells Gideon, how exactly do you want me to go about doing this? And first Gideon says, well, let's have the dew be on the ground but not on the fleece. And then the next day it's on the fleece but not on the ground, or I might have switched those backwards, but you know what I'm talking about. By asking the person to give the terms of the miracle, it just further proves that God is capable of doing it. It's not an accident. The frogs didn't happen just to disappear. It happens right when Pharaoh asked for it. And so Pharaoh says, okay, tomorrow, and Moses says in verse 10, let it be according to your word, that you may know that there is no one like the Lord our God. They worship all of these other gods, but he's trying to prove there is no one like this God. This is the one. And so Moses does it. The next day he goes out and he gets rid of the frogs. And verse 14, they gathered them together in heaps. They all just died. And it says the land just stank. It was just this kind of disgusting, froggy, dead mess. And verse 15, when Pharaoh saw, I think this is really key, when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened his heart, and he did not heed them, as the Lord had said. I think it's kind of like this for some people, and for Pharaoh here. Since we're talking about frogs, we'll just use a frog as an example. Imagine that there is a frog, and he really has two paths that he can go down. He can hop down this path, and he can hunt his flies on the path, or there's a pond in front of him. And the pond has these nice lily pads on them that are soft, and they've got flies that just surround them, and just easy eating, comfortable. But to get to the lily pad, he has to hop over a pond that is full of just boiling water. It's constantly boiling. And so, if you miss the lily pad, you get to land in boiling water, which as a frog is really not an ideal situation. And so, he loves the lily pad. He wants to be on the lily pad. And so he thinks, well, I can probably make it, and he hops out, and he hops to the next one, and he's having a great time until he misses once. And then he screams and shouts, help, help, I need out of this lily pad. And so someone comes and scoops him up and puts him back on the dry ground, and he says, that's really the path for you. There's no boiling water that way. This is, just a much better situation. And he says, you're probably right. But then now that he's out of the boiling water, now that he's out of the fire, that lily pad suddenly looks very appealing again, and he thinks, well, I could probably make it to that one, and he jumps back out to it. That's what sin is, a momentary pleasure. Some people hate the consequences of sin. Some people hate to deal with the trouble that sin brings, but they never learn to hate sin. They love sin. And so when the consequences catch up with them, I want back in. I want out of this mess. I want back in the church, or I want back into your good graces. I want to get rid of these consequences. But once the consequences have faded, once they're not hurting anymore, or once their loved ones have kind of gotten past it, or whatever it is, it's just right back out to the lily pad, right back out to where they came from, because they didn't learn to hate sin. And that is something the Bible says that we can do. That's the problem with sin, is it's temptation. James 1 says, your own desires. It's something that you want. It entices you and pulls you away. But in Psalm 119, he says, I have learned to hate every evil way. I have learned to hate every evil way. The first 9 chapters of Proverbs are all about a person who's growing in wisdom, and therefore the wiser he becomes, the more he hates the sin that he used to get caught up in. And so we can train ourselves not just to hate the consequences of sin, but to hate the sin itself. And that greatly decreases the odds that we'll go back to it. But that's not where Pharaoh is. And so I think that the point that we see from the second plague of frogs with Pharaoh is, if you ever find yourself in a position where you hate consequences, but when you think about the sin, you still think about it longingly. When you think about the thing that you used to do or are tempted to do, you think, it would just feel so nice or so good just for a moment to go back to that. When you think about the sin, you still love it, you're in a dangerous position. And you need to drop everything. You need to make the primary goal of that moment, what can I do to teach myself to hate sin? Because as long as I hate consequences but love sin, I'm in a place where my heart is somewhat hard. And if I keep rolling down this mountain, it's just going to get harder and harder until I don't know the difference anymore. Any thoughts or comments on Pharaoh and his pet frogs?
I wonder how many of them they ate.
Maybe a few, I guess, but it's like they seem to have rotted so quickly that I think, you just waited till they all went away. Yes?
Wasn't there an Egyptian beauty that was a frog?
There certainly was.
But it may have been like anti
I'm not really
Or
sure.
they were anti-cow eating.
Yes.
That family.
That's very likely. They made most deities, most animals into some kind of deity, and that there certainly is. I decided not to get into all the deities tonight from Egypt, just so that we could kind of get through the material in a more practical way. But for all of these, there is some kind of Egyptian deity that is associated with this plague, where God is proving this frog deity that should be able to control the frogs and keep this from happening, clearly isn't able to do their job compared to God. And so, yes, Miss Faye.
Every time Pharaoh would relent, and then he'd get his way,
Yes.
he would change his mind again. And I don't know how many times he did that, but it was just amazing that he made them believe that he was going to let them go.
Yes, and that's Moses is actually going to address that when we get to chapter 9. I think that's a very good observation, and I think we'll come back around to it, because he's going to address the idea of
Circle back.
yes of you keep tricking us, and no, that's perfect. So all right, the third plague then, Exodus chapter 8 and verses 16 to 19. The third plague is the plague of lice, or the word that's used for lice. It could be ticks. It could be mosquitoes, it could be lice, but the essence is some small, very annoying bug that's very hard to get rid of in numbers that are just disproportional to what you would expect. And so these bugs just consume all of the people, and they're itchy and they're miserable. It's kind of fun in verse 15. It says, verse 17. In verse 17 it says, Aaron stretched out his hand with his rod, and he struck the dust of the earth, and it became the lice on man and beast. And so there's this sort of miraculous dust turning into bugs kind of thing. And, when you think that God uses sand to describe Abraham's descendants as, as numerous as the sand, well, if you kind of take that parallel and you say there's lice as numerous as the dust, you're basically saying just unending lice that's just on every man, woman, child, and beast in the land. But what this plague introduces, that the other plagues haven't seen yet, is the magician's response to it in verse 18. It says, so the magicians worked with their enchantments to bring forth lice, but they couldn't do that. Now, they had done something convincing to Pharaoh for the previous two plagues, and for the other signs with the snakes and those kinds of things, but they could not figure out how to make it seem like they could bring lice out of dust. And so there was lice on man and beast. And then verse 19, I think this is really important. The magicians themselves say to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. Now, finger is the idea of this is the work, or this is the hand, this is the action. God is the word Elohim, and so that takes us back to Genesis 1. In the beginning, Elohim created the heavens and the earth. This is the creator this is the work, the finger of the creator God. This is the work of, the highest God, the God who made everything else, is what they're getting at. And so what they're insinuating is, this is a God who is higher than you, Pharaoh. This is a God that you can't play games with. This is a God that you can't defeat. And so they're pretty much ready to throw in the towel. But it says in verse 19, Pharaoh's heart grew hard, and he did not heed him, just as the Lord had said. And so, you think, what's going on here? You think, imagine if you were, let's say for a long time you were looking at an optical illusion of some kind, and it seemed like the optical illusion was pointing in this direction. And so, all this time you've been going this direction, and you kept going in circles, coming back to the same optical illusion. But finally, the last time that you're there, you look at it, and you can see, once you look at the optical illusion in just the right way, suddenly it's like, oh, I see what it is, and kind of comes to light differently than it was before. And the actual picture is pointing this way. And you think, oh, I'll just go this way anyway. That's what I've been doing the whole time, right? So you just keep walking in circles even though you can see where it's pointing now. The evidence, Pharaoh's evidence, is kind of like dominoes. There's all this evidence that Pharaoh is using to support his theory that he is more powerful than Moses is God. And he's got the idea that he's been told since birth that he was a god, and he's got these magicians that can do their own seeming miracles. And slowly, this evidence, one by one, like those dominoes that you can line up. Have you ever done that? Line up dominoes, and then it's just so satisfying, isn't it, when you flick it, if it makes it all the way to the end. It just feels like the world is right, doesn't it? But, it's got all these dominoes, and they're just falling one by one, and this is a big one. This is a crucial domino. The magicians who can perform the same miracles as Pharaoh say, we can't do this. This is something much bigger than any of us. And so, how do you have a crucial piece of evidence go against you, and you just choose anyway to ignore that evidence? And when your evidence points somewhere else than what you believe, not somebody else's evidence, when your own evidence, all the things that you've ever believed, are now pointing in a different direction, that should be a sign that you have changes to make. And so if you come to the point where your evidence is pointing in a different direction, and you think, I'm just going to keep going the way that I've been going, that should be a terrifying moment. And we talk about Pharaoh, and I think sometimes we think of this as, we think of it from the perspective of someone who's not saved, from a non-Christian, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. There can be Christians in any pew, in any church, who can become a Pharaoh, because we can always harden our heart against God's word if we choose to. And so even as Christians, if we find a moment where all the evidence of what we thought we should do or what we believed is now pointing somewhere else, and we don't want to follow it, we should think, I'm developing a hard heart, and I need to do something about that now before it rolls into an avalanche that I can't stop. And so the magicians are really kind of key there in this third one. Any thoughts or comments about the plague of lice/ticks/mosquitoes?
Mine says gnats.
Gnats, yeah. Some do say gnats, and so, just tiny annoying bugs. Yeah, something that could probably bite you.
I think if it had been the last, I'd have to put Pharaoh out of misery myself.
You wonder, how is he not assassinated? That's the hand of God right there, I think, that he wasn't. God says, I have a purpose for all this. So, yeah, couldn't stand it. Yeah. I had lice as a kid one time, and it was miserable. My mom would just scrub my head, and I just hated it so much. But, all right. Yeah, some people do. Verse 20 starts the fourth plague. This is the plague of flies. And, you're thinking, you ever watch a horse, slap its tail against its side because it's so annoyed by all the flies, or watch a person, just kind of keep doing this. You ever sit at a restaurant and the fly just won't go away, and it's over all your food and over your hair, and it's just always there, and that's kind of the idea here, and possible even that it's more like a horse fly, something that can bite, maybe even something that can spread disease. And so, you've got something that's at least annoying, if not dangerous to life. And what's different here, there's two things. This is the first time that God says that he's going to keep the Israelites from this plague. So notice in verse 22, it says, and in that day, when he sends the flies, I will set apart the land of Goshen, in which my people dwell, that no swarms of flies shall be there, in order that you may, this is why, that you may know that I am the Lord in the midst of the land. And so, it seems like these first three plagues, the people of Israel have suffered right along with everyone else. Kind of like we talked about in the book of Revelation. Sometimes we suffer along with everyone else when there's plagues on our land. They seem to have suffered along with them. But here, God is making a distinction, and he says, I'm going to show you the difference. I'm going to show you who I'm with. They will not suffer with. Verse 23 says, I will make a difference between my people and your people. Tomorrow, this sign shall be. But the second thing, and I think this is really key here, the second thing that's different in this plague is that Moses finally explains to us the reason why God wants them to go 3 days into the wilderness. Because after the flies come and Pharaoh's kind of had enough of it, this is the second time he relents. So he asked Moses to take the frogs away. He did not ask Moses, at least it's not recorded, to take the lice away. But this time the flies, he's sick of the flies. He asked Moses to take the flies away. But he kind of changes what God is asking for a little bit. And he says, you may go and sacrifice in this land. sort of the idea of like, don't leave Egypt, don't go into the wilderness, you're just going to stay home and make your sacrifices. And in response, Moses says it would not be right for us to do that. And if you're kind of following along, he starts to explain this in verse 26. It is not right to do so, for we would be sacrificing the abomination of the Egyptians to the Lord our God. If we sacrifice the abomination of Egyptians before their eyes, then will they not stone us? Now the abomination, Exodus never clarifies exactly what that is. I think the most likely the abomination is that they're sacrificing sheep, because Genesis explains in at least a couple of different places that shepherds lived way away from the Egyptians because shepherds were considered the keepers of the abominations. Something about sheep Egyptians just found unlikable. I'm not really sure. And it could be, the Egyptians, they did sacrifice animals, but when they sacrificed animals, they thought of that as like sacrificing the enemy of their gods, and they didn't do nearly as much with the blood as Israelites did. And so some people think maybe that it's just how much they do with blood, and that that's the abomination. But whatever it is, the point that he's making is, if they watch us make our sacrifices, they will be offended and they'll kill us. And so, this is a perfectly reasonable train of thought. Sarah, were you going to say something?
They also worship the cows in Egypt, and Israel sacrificed cows.
Yes, that is
So
another.
both of them considered.
It would be sheep are an abomination, and cows shouldn't be killed. Is in essence what you're saying. Yeah, and so if they were killing cows and that offended the Egyptians, then they might stone them. So there's really a lot of things that could be concerned here. But Moses is really making just a very logical kind of explanation. We need to go 3 days in the desert, not just because we feel like it, or not just for some kind of sojourn to some, it's just because we don't want to die when we make our sacrifices. And really, he's saying, this is what God has told us to do. And so in essence, the argument he's making is, our God is a reasonable and logical God. But Pharaoh says, he says, I'll let you go in verse 28. And then, of course, back down in verse 32, after it all goes away, Pharaoh hardened his heart at this time also, and neither would he let the people go. And so, essentially the domino that's falling here for Pharaoh is kind of the idea of, if the other person who you're arguing with or who believes differently than you is making reasonable, logical, satisfactory arguments, and you're not, but you still choose your direction, you probably are developing a hard heart, and that should be of great concern to you. And so, have you ever watched someone do this? I literally watched someone do this sometime. There was a man at a restaurant, and I heard what he ordered. The tables were all like right next to each other, and he was sitting right next to us. And I heard what he ordered, and the waitress brought out what he ordered. But when she came, he said, "This is not what I ordered." And she probably shouldn't have, but she argued just a little bit. She's like, "No, you really did. This is what you ordered." And she kind of like walked him through what he ordered, and he was so insistent. And then I was watching because I was just curious at this point. I wasn't even eavesdropping anymore. I'm just staring at this point. But you kind of see it cross his face. This like, I remember now. But he never said it. He just said, "I'll just eat it." He never said, "I remember this is what I actually ordered." His pride or his embarrassment wouldn't let him say that out loud. And that's kind of the idea of what the other person is saying is actually more logical than what you're saying. It's actually more true than what you're saying, but you can't let yourself say it out loud. That's where Pharaoh is. What's that?
I know who that was.
You know who it was? Okay, don't share. We don't want to talking about anybody. It's nobody here, I promise. Not my person anyway, but yeah. But that's funny, Mr. Fink. That's when their arguments make more sense than yours, but you can't let it go, you really have to ask yourself, am I rolling toward a very hard heart? Am I rolling to a place where I won't even recognize that I'm not obeying God anymore when I wake up tomorrow morning? And so there's this problem in Pharaoh's heart in the fourth plague with the flies. Any thoughts or comments about the plague with the flies? All right. Chapter 9 then begins the fifth plague, and this is when God plagues the livestock with diseases. And this one's interesting. It's a short account. And remember, in the fourth plague with the flies, that was the first time that God said that he was going to make a distinction between the Israelites and the Egyptians. That the Israelites were not going to suffer the same stuff as the Egyptians. And that seems to be true for the rest of the plagues. It seems like the fourth plague was the first time that happened, but it's consistent for the rest of the time. And so it's true here as well. And what's interesting, he says that in verse 4, the Lord will make a difference between the livestock of Israel and the livestock of Egypt. So nothing shall die of all that belongs to the children of Israel. And then in verse 5, he says, tomorrow the Lord will do this thing in the land. And so he does it. But what's important here is this is the first time that we look and see that Pharaoh goes and double checks whether this is true or not. Because remember, the slaves all lived in kind of a different place, Goshen, and no one knows exactly where it is in Egypt, but it seems like it was probably sort of a little bit to the north and to the west, I think. And it was a very fertile land because when Jacob came to the original Pharaoh at the end of Genesis, he said, pick the best land, because Jacob was such an honored person. And so they have this beautiful, fertile land that these slaves are living in. And of course, they're slaves now, but they don't live just right next door to Pharaoh. And so with this plague, he says, your animals are going to die, their animals are not going to die. Pharaoh says, well, let's just see if that's true or not. And so it says in verse 7, he says, then Pharaoh sent, and indeed, not even one of the livestock of the Israelites was dead. And so you almost get the idea that maybe even if an animal was supposed to die that day of like a natural cause, something happened to keep them alive, but certainly there was no sickness. Certainly there was nothing going on there as far as the plague. But verse 7, the heart of Pharaoh became hard, and he did not let the people go. And so, this is kind of like if you see dark, heavy rain clouds in the sky, and then you go and you lay down and you take a nap. And then you wake up from your nap and you see dark, heavy rain clouds in the sky. And then you go outside, you look in your rain gauge, and it says that there's 6 inches in your rain gauge. And then you say, I sure wish it had rained today. It's like, well, clearly it did rain today. And someone who would say it didn't rain today is someone who's clearly ignoring the evidence. He's checking the evidence, and he's finding that what God says is true. His magicians have said, you've got to believe this guy. Stop putting us through all of this. And the people are suffering, and he is suffering. Everything is lining up perfectly. And, that's kind of the idea here. The domino is, if God is with the person that is, opposite of you, and he's not with you, you might should wonder whether or not you're on the right side. Because God is very clearly with them. God is very clearly not with Pharaoh and his people. Now, today, of course, that would look a little different for people. What would it look like? How would we check this kind of evidence today if God is with one person and not with another person? How would we check that kind of evidence today? It'd be different than in Pharaoh's time. For Pharaoh, it was they're blessed. You can see their physical blessings. They don't have the disease. We are not blessed physically. But we know that the Bible says that oftentimes righteous people are not blessed physically, and wicked people are blessed physically. So, today we wouldn't be looking so much at physical blessings. And of course, oftentimes in the Old Testament they had ways to communicate directly with God, where he would communicate directly back from it. You think about Balaam, and Balaam's trying to kind of toe the line there of prophet and following God, and so God tells the donkey to tell him, you're doing the wrong thing, but God's not going to do that for us today. And so, what is the one method that God has given us today that allows us to see, am I really lined up with God, or is it actually that somebody else is more lined up with God than me? His Word. And so today, as we find differences between people, if we find differences between what we in this room believe or what Christians believe, the only way to really know, well, who is God with on this matter and who is God not with on this matter, is to go back to his Word. And if we find ourselves in opposition and we refuse to change because of pride or embarrassment or whatever it may be, then that should be a devastating moment of, I'm allowing my heart to get harder and harder. And so that's a devastating moment of, I'm going to not go to work today. I'm going to stay home and pray and study and call a friend and talk to somebody and figure something out, because something has got to change. My heart is getting harder and harder. I need to do something about that. And so that's really the primary difference there with the 5th plague of a diseased livestock. Any thoughts or comments on that plague or on that kind of hardness of heart that Pharaoh has? All right. We'll continue then with the 6th plague. This one just makes me cringe. The boils that they all had. And it starts in verse 8. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Take for yourselves handfuls of ashes from a furnace, and let Moses scatter it toward the heavens in the sight of Pharaoh." And so I'm not sure if they took it from a furnace at home and carried it to Pharaoh. I get the sense that probably they used one of Pharaoh's furnaces. And so this is what I picture it looks like. They walk into Pharaoh, and they go to one of his furnaces, and they scoop out a bunch of ashes. And verse 9 says, "And it will become fine dust in all the land of Egypt, and it will cause boils that break out in sores on man and beast throughout all the land of Egypt." And so they took the ashes from the furnace, and they stood before Pharaoh, and he scattered them toward the heavens. So he just kind of scoops it up and throws it in the air, and then suddenly all the people, except the Israelites, start breaking out in these terrible boils as the ashes fall down on them. And they cause boils that break out in sores on man and on beast. Now, what's different this time is found in verse 11. It says, "The magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils, for the boils were on the magicians as it was on all of the Egyptians." And so this is the first time that the magicians have just refused to come see Moses at all. And it seems to indicate it's because they just literally couldn't get out of bed that day. They were just too miserable and too sick from these boils. And boils, you think they're like some kind of pocket of pus probably on your skin or something. Boils, especially in ancient times, tended to be diseases that sometimes left lifelong and crippling problems for people. It wasn't just a scar or something. Sometimes those boils could impact your nervous system, and people would be crippled. People couldn't walk. This is a nationwide plague that might be taking out whole generations of workers and people from among them. And so it's a very terrible thing. But as we said, what's different here is the magicians are refusing to appear before Moses now. So earlier they said, "We can't do this. This is the hand of God." And kind of the domino that fell is the idea of your evidence is pointing somewhere else. But here, it's not just that the evidence points somewhere else. Your evidence has failed you entirely. It didn't even show up to work that day. The thing that you've always counted on, whatever you're trusting to keep you on the path that you're going on, just completely crumbled underneath you. And there's just no way that you can say, "Well, but what about this?" Because everyone's going to say, "That didn't even show up today. That's not even possible." And it's kind of like, I remember when we were living in close to Fort Worth, there was a lady who lived, I didn't know her, but she lived not too far from us, and I read about her on the news. And she had began an online relationship with a man who she believed was, I think she believed he was Justin Bieber, the Canadian pop star. It may have been a different celebrity, but it was someone kind of like that, And so she had this budding romance with Justin Bieber, and he often asked her for large amounts of money, and she often sent it. And he would send her little gifts, and he even sent her an engagement ring, I think a very cheap engagement ring in the mail. If you haven't met your boyfriend and he sends you an engagement ring in the mail, please don't say yes to that. I don't think he's very sincere. But, he would send her little cheap gifts in the mail, which I think means not only was she sending him money, but she sent him her physical address, which is just horrifying. And anyway, when the police busted this guy, that's when she figured it out. And you think for months, almost a year, she kept sending him money. And if you send money away to someone and they keep saying they're going to come see you, and then they keep calling you or messaging you to ask you for more money so they can come see you, but there's always an excuse why they never make it, you should probably start to doubt the evidence that they really are who they say they are, and that they're really going to provide whatever it is that they're offering to provide for you. That's the idea here. All the evidence says Justin Bieber's not coming, but Pharaoh just believes it anyway. But the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, and he did not heed them, just as the Lord had spoken to Moses. All right, so any thoughts on the boils before we move on to the last one, the plague of hail? All right.
You just always think about leprosy when you think about boils.
Yes, there may be some relationship there.
They might have thought that when, that was the start of it or something, when they get boiled like that.
Yes. Well, and that brings up a good point I hadn't thought of before, Don, that, skin diseases in ancient culture, just like in the law of Moses, keeps the priests from being able to serve in their temples. And so it's very likely that this plague shuts down all religious activity in Egypt. I'd never thought about that before, but when you think Pharaoh was basing all of this off his religion, and now all religious activity may be shut down, that's pretty significant evidence that you really should be doing something different.
Well, I also wondered if it was the same kind of boils Job had.
It could be, yeah. And that's, he took the pots and he kind of scraped the broken pots to scrape them off. And there's some speculation that even those boils were kind of like a death sentence for people that Job had, and that, God sort of miraculously heals them from him in the end. And so, yes, ma'am, that's very possible.
It's the same word.
Same word, okay, yeah, so probably so then. All right, last plague, the seventh plague, the plague of hail. This is by far, at least in Pharaoh's opinion, the most devastating of the plagues so far. And you notice the way that God talks about it. Notice verse 14, he says, "For at this time I will send all my plagues to your very heart." Now, he says all my plagues, and so I think there's some foreshadowing here about the 10th plague, which is obviously the most devastating for everybody. But yeah, he says, "To your very heart, and on your servants, and on your people, that you may know that there is none like me in all the earth." Remember, the idea of heart in Jewish mind is the idea of the seat of decision making. And that's really interesting when you think about what God says here. He says, cutting down to verse 19, he says, "Therefore, you have a decision to make. Send now and gather your livestock and all that you have in the field, for the hail shall come down on every man and every animal which is found in the field, and is not brought home, and they shall die." And so verse 20, there are two kinds of people, and they've made two different kinds of decisions. The first group, he who feared the word of the Lord among the servants of Pharaoh, made his servants and his livestock flee to the houses. Verse 21, but he who did not regard the word of the Lord left his servants and his livestock in the field. Now, my question is, which one do you think Pharaoh probably is? It doesn't tell us for sure. It doesn't say if he brought his livestock in or not. You notice Pharaoh is alive after this, and his heir, his son, is alive after this. So my guess is Pharaoh sent his servants out to the field that day. Pharaoh kept his livestock outside that day because he's awfully sure of himself, but not so sure to go outside that day himself. He and his son stayed inside that day. And so, he perhaps is one of those. But the idea is, he says, I will send my plague to your very heart. And so it's not just, will you let the Israelites go? But he gives the other Egyptians a chance to save themselves, at least, from this plague, if they'll just heed the word and bring their livestock and bring their servants inside. And I think that's part of what makes it so devastating. It says at the end of verse 23, the Lord rained hail on the land of Egypt. So there was hail and fire mingled with hail, so very heavy that there was none like it in all the land of Egypt since it became a nation. And the hail struck throughout the whole land of Egypt, all that was in the field, both man and beast. And the hail struck every herb of the field and broke every tree of the field. Only in the land of Goshen, where the children of Israel were, there was no hail. And notice Pharaoh's response in verse 27. Pharaoh sent and called for Moses and Aaron and said to them, I have sinned this time. Now, really, he's sinned every time, hasn't he? He's not willing to concede that. But it hurts so bad this time that he will say, I have sinned this time. Why did it hurt so bad this time that he's willing to go this far? If you have all of your livestock out in your field, you have all of your wealth out in your field. You have no wealth. And that's what happened to Job, right? After all his livestock is killed, or taken away, he has no wealth left. If you have all of your servants out in your field, you have no labor for the palace, for his immediate service. You have no labor left. And so it's not just Pharaoh, but the wealthy class of Egypt, except for the few who did bring their servants and their livestock inside. It's as if all the wealthy people in America suddenly had no money, but none of the poor people do either. There's just suddenly no wealth left at all. How are people going to survive? Who's going to store up food for the winter? Who's going to keep people afloat if most of the wealthy are no longer wealthy? This was devastating in every possible way economically. And that's really what hits Pharaoh. When you hit someone in their pocketbook, that's when you get them, right? So that's really what gets Pharaoh. He says, I have sinned this time. And notice how he says it. The Lord is righteous, and my people and I are wicked. Yes?
Well, I just imagine that it probably became kind of a political thing as they're debating whether or not to prepare. And it's like, well, if you stand with Pharaoh, you're going to leave your animals out in the field.
Right.
And so he's kind of campaigning for people to make this choice with him. And I think also, whenever a natural disaster happens and something of yours gets destroyed, it kind of hits differently than if you've been just irresponsible and something of yours gets destroyed. Because you can kind of say, well, that just happened and I did the best I could and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But whenever you've been warned and you know better, you've got the loss and the guilt, and that's a deeper
Yes.
regret.
I think that's true. Kind of what she's talking about is it's apolitical, because now, if Pharaoh said, I will keep these animals and servants alive through my deity, and then he fails, you're going to have people calling for him to be, thrown off the throne or whatever. And then kind of alongside of that, the people themselves now had a choice. And so now they feel like they have more of a say in all of this. And so it's a little bit more personal. And so if they were trusting in Pharaoh, it's not just, well, it was just a natural disaster we couldn't have prevented. It was, I could have saved all of this and I didn't. And so there's more of that kind of regret. So I think that's a good point. But he says, I have sinned, the Lord is righteous, and my people and I are wicked. And so, this is the first time it's truly personal for Pharaoh. And this is the first time that we see him talk about it as sin. But what's really important here is what Moses says in verse 30. And this comes back around to what Ms. Faye was talking about earlier. Moses says, but as for you and your servants, Moses says, I know that you will not yet fear the Lord God. And so Pharaoh says, I've sinned. And we've seen people do this. They get caught and they say, I sinned, I messed up. But after a while, you start to figure out they never really mean that. They feel sorry not because of the sin, but because they got caught in their sin. And that's exactly where Pharaoh is. And so you come back down to verse 34. When Pharaoh saw that the rain and the hail and the thunder had ceased, he sinned yet more. And he hardened his heart. He knows it's sin. He said it himself. It's sin. He hardened his heart and his servants. So the heart of Pharaoh was hard. Neither would he let the children of Israel go, as the Lord had spoken to Moses. And so, this is kind of like the boy who cries wolf. He says one thing, but he doesn't really mean it. This is, if you think of, imagine a millionaire who repeatedly walks into different stores in town and shoplifts things. And everyone knows that he's doing it, but he always says, no, I won't do it next time. I won't do it next time. But eventually I'm not going to let him in the store anymore, right? Because they know he's lying. They know that he's going to just shoplift again. This is someone who doesn't want to get caught. And so they'll say anything to escape the consequences of what they've gone through. But they always intend to go right back to it. And so if you find yourself making the same mistake and making the same apologies, but in the back of your mind always thinking, I will go back to this when I have an opportunity, that is a terrifyingly hard heart. That is a terrifying place to be. That's something that needs to be said out loud and dealt with and prayed about and studied over and figured out, because that kind of hard heart is sneaky, and that kind of hard heart just keeps on rolling and accumulating more and more snow until, the book of Hebrews describes people who get to the point where they don't even see the need to repent anymore in chapter 6. And so it doesn't matter what you say or what you do, because they won't repent. They can't even see the need for repentance. There is no hope for them anymore. We never want to let ourselves get to that place. Pharaoh, I think, is a very strong warning that God is very patient. There's 10 plagues. He's very patient. And he comes at Pharaoh with several different things. But that as patient as God is, we are capable of having stubbornness that outlasts God's patience. And God's patience will eventually end. And we need to be ready to make changes in our heart as soon as we notice the tiniest signs of hardness, or else they can grow and spread. And so any last thoughts here from anyone about Pharaoh and any of these plagues that we've looked at tonight? Sarah?
They didn't start the wheat and the snow.
That's right, yes. And that is,
above ground yet.
it's interesting because he kind of gives us a timeline there. It probably puts this in January or February based on their growing seasons. And so some of them had not been planted, or at least that they were not really out of the ground yet. So they did have some food coming, but it still would have been devastating for them.
Yeah, they would have been.
Yeah. Any other thoughts or comments? That was in
Exactly.
that was in verse 31 and verse 32 if you were looking at that. All right, well, we will wrap it up there, and I will turn it over, I suppose, to Johnny.